A Genomic History of Aboriginal Australia by Emily Milburn, Kimberly Watson, Natalia Waldron, Blake Glover, and Alex Stoles. The first genomic study on the origins of Aboriginal Australians was conducted by running tests on and working with Aboriginal Australians. This article took on many questions that are fundamental in understanding how genetics in Australia works. These questions include when Australia was populated, what was the diversity of the people within Australia, and how many waves of people came out of Africa. This process is very crucial because this study is testing some of the oldest living human populations on Earth. The result found in this experiment was that the Aboriginal Australian groups are all descendants of the same ancestral population that first colonized Australia. This further promotes Darwin's idea of common ancestry. To test the genomic structure of the Aboriginal Australians, they took samples from 83 different Aboriginal Australian groups, as well as 25 Papuans from New Guinea. They collected saliva samples for DNA sequencing from Aboriginal Australian communities and individuals in Australia. They sequenced genomes from Aboriginal Australian individuals who were from different geographical regions and who had different cultures and spoke different languages. Additionally, they sequenced Papuan genomes from individual representatives of different linguistic groups. These datasets were compared with previously published genomes and genotype data.
By exploring different admixtures and estimating ancestry proportions, they found that the genomic diversity of Aboriginal Australian populations is best modeled as a mixture of four main genetic ancestries. These ancestries can be assigned to four different geographic regions based on their relative frequencies, which are Europe, East Asia, New Guinea, and Australia, having a significantly higher Aboriginal Australian component. Based on these results, it shows how the Australian population all came from the Aboriginal Australian population.
The study concluded that the inhabitants of Australia and New Guinea all came from common ancestors that came from Africa in a single wave. Previous to this study, there was a debate on how the ancestors of the people currently living in Asia, Europe, and Australia migrated over from Africa. One theory was that their ancestors came from Africa in one wave at a common time, and the other theory was that the migration of their ancestors from Africa occurred in two or more waves at multiple different times. Therefore, after this study was concluded, it was found that all non-African inhabitants around the world can be traced back to having left Africa in one wave, around the same time, around 50,000 years ago.
As groups of people started to migrate from Africa, one of the first places they migrated towards was the Middle East of Australia. The Aboriginal Australians had an advantage over the other countries' populations of about 10,000 years. Australia's isolation from the rest of the world allowed the population to grow much more quickly, and the Australian ancestor population grew more than the Asian and European ancestry populations. About 50 to 60,000 years ago, the first Aboriginal Australians started to reach the pool, the combination of Australia and New Guinea, and they began splitting into smaller groups that no longer had close contact or interactions within each other. So today, Papuans and Australians, which should be some of the most closely related groups, are actually very different genetically. Another problem that this study tries to address is attempting to determine how new languages have begun to form in Australia and New Guinea in the last 4,000 years, despite the ancestral records of these locations dating back to over 50,000 years ago. What they found is that these new languages began to arise in eastern Australia. They could clearly see the gene flow and movement of people spreading across the continent and leaving their genetic signature along the way. This spread of gene flow from east to west across Australia began around 4,000 to 6,000 years ago.
This is the time where these new languages and cultures are spread. This gene flow came about from a very small part of the population. To put this in more understandable terms, think of it as a small group of people going into a village, telling the people to start speaking a new language, and then leaving after having offspring. This left their footprint and brought about a whole new dynamic to the village. The results of this portion of the study show a clear phylogenetic tree that encompasses the languages that are spoken in modern-day Aboriginal Australian groups.